The smell of the Sacramento Valley in October is particular. It isn't romantic the way people who've never worked in it imagine, not wine and lavender and golden light pooling on hillsides. It's diesel from the delivery trucks idling behind the warehouse, and the faintly sweet rot of grapes left too long on the vine in the lower parcels, and the dust that comes off the dry creek beds when the wind shifts east. I grew up with that smell on my clothes and in my hair, and for a long time I thought it was the smell of belonging somewhere. I thought it was the smell of home. I was 31 years old, and I had worked for Calloway Agricultural Supply for 9 years. My name is Presley Calloway. I am the middle child of 3 and the only daughter, and those two facts together formed the shape of my entire professional life before I understood what they meant. My father's name is Wade Calloway. He built the company from a single-bay equipment rental operation in Elk Grove in 1991, which he told at every board dinner, every family Christmas, every conversation that lasted long enough to reach the subject of origins. By the time I joined the company at 22, fresh out of Cal Poly with a supply chain degree and the particular hunger of someone who has watched her father build something and wants to understand the machinery of it from the inside, Calloway Agricultural Supply had 3 warehouses, 14 full-time regional account managers, and annual revenue my father rounded to just over $11 million. When he talked to neighbors and closer to 14 when he talked to vendors. The gap between those two numbers was something I would understand later. My older brother, Colton, had been with the company since he was 19. He worked in equipment logistics, scheduling, maintenance coordination, delivery routing. He was competent at it. He was not exceptional at it. I say that without malice. Colton had a gift for the social architecture of the place, for the kind of easy authority that comes from being the firstborn son in a family business where firstborn sons are treated like heirs apparent from approximately age 12. He remembered birthdays. He bought the warehouse crew lunch on Fridays. He was well-liked in the way that people are well-liked when nothing is required of them that they cannot easily give. My younger brother, Bo, had come aboard 6 years ago at 23, placed directly into a senior account manager role that I had spent 4 years building toward. My father called it a strategic hire at the time. He used that phrase at the dinner table while I was sitting there, having just closed the Yolo County Cooperative contract, a 2-year, $800,000 account that had taken me 7 months of site visits, pricing revisions, and a Saturday I still cannot account for involving a malfunctioning irrigation pump and a borrowed set of tools from a stranger's truck on Highway 113. The Yolo County contract was the largest single account the company had signed in 4 years. My father raised his glass of Napa Red and said, "Good week for the Calloways," and I thought he meant me. He was talking about Bo's hire. I tell you that story not to establish a pattern, though it was a pattern, but because it was the last time I mistook his indifference for oversight. After that dinner, I began keeping records. Not with any particular purpose in mind. I was not plotting anything. I was simply a person with a supply chain degree and 9 years of professional experience, and when something in a system did not add up, my instinct was to count it. By October of my 9th year at Calloway Agricultural Supply, I was managing the company's 3 largest accounts, covering the Sacramento Delta region, and serving as the de facto operations coordinator for the warehouse in West Sacramento, a role that did not appear on my job description and did not appear in my compensation. I had asked about the title once, 2 years prior, in a meeting with my father and our then HR coordinator, a quiet woman named Linda who has since retired to Medford. My father had said the company was still growing into its org chart. Linda had typed something. I had let the meeting end. Our current HR coordinator was a man named Dale, who had been with the company for 11 months and who, to his credit, was meticulous. He kept paper records in addition to the digital system, which was a habit left over from a prior job in county government and which would matter later, though I didn't know that yet. The event that cracked the surface open happened 3 weeks before the Tuesday that broke everything, and it happened in front of a client, which was the part one hadn't expected. I was in a conference call with the Sacramento Growers Collective, seated at the small round table in my Elk Grove office with the door closed and my laptop open and the speakerphone in the center of the table, walking their rotating committee chair through a revised equipment lease structure I had spent the prior weekend building. The revision addressed a recurring scheduling conflict on their eastern member farms, a timing problem in the booking system that had caused 3 late equipment deliveries in the past quarter, which was 3 more than acceptable. I had mapped the conflict, identified its source in the committee's approval lag, and built a tiered booking option that would let the Eastern Farm schedule standard orders directly without waiting for committee sign-off. It was not a complicated fix. It was the kind of fix that required someone to have read the booking logs carefully enough to find where the friction actually lived, which I had, which was why I was the one presenting it. I was midway through the second tier of the proposal when my email chimed. The desktop notification, which I had not silenced because I was expecting a vendor confirmation unrelated to the call. I glanced at it from reflex. The email was from my father. It was addressed to the full regional account management team, which included me and Colton and 3 other coordinators. The subject line read, "Collective Account Update." I did not open it. I kept my voice where it was and continued through the lease structure, and the committee chair asked 2 good questions about the Eastern Farm threshold, and I answered them, and by the time I ended the call and thanked them for their time and closed the speakerphone, I had been sitting with the email notification for 11 minutes. I opened it. The email was 4 sentences. It informed the regional account management team that, effective immediately, any pricing modifications affecting collective member accounts were to be reviewed and approved by Colton before being presented to the client. It cited a need for consistent client-facing messaging across the portfolio. It was dated that morning. It had been sent while I was on the call presenting the exact kind of pricing modification it was now requiring Colton to review. Colton, who had not been in the collective account in any capacity in the 3 years I had managed it. Colton, whose desk was 2 rooms down the hall and who had, to my knowledge, attended exactly 1 collective meeting, a general onboarding session 4 years ago when my father had brought him through the Elk Grove accounts as part of a portfolio orientation. Colton, who managed equipment logistics and whose primary client contact was a fleet coordinator in Stockton who called twice a month. I sat at the round table for a moment. I read the email again. I set my hands flat on the table. Then I picked up the phone and called the committee chair back. "Patricia," I said when she answered, "I want to flag something. The revised lease structure I walked you through today is complete on my end and ready for your internal review. If you have questions in the next few days, reach out to me directly, same number. There may be some internal communication routing at our end, but your primary contact doesn't change." Patricia paused. "Is everything all right over there?" "Everything's fine," I said. "I just wanted to make sure the line of contact was clear." We said goodbye. I set the phone down. I looked at my father's email for a moment longer, and I thought about the 4 sentences and what they represented. Not an operational decision, not a genuine concern about messaging consistency, but a signal sent while I was on a call, routed past me to a brother who had no context for the account and would not have understood the lease revision if I'd explained it to him in writing. A signal about whose work in this company required another man's review before it could reach a client. I did not go to my father's office that afternoon. I had learned, over 9 years, that arriving with visible feeling in a room where feeling was treated as evidence of irrationality was the fastest way to lose the ground you were standing on. I went back to my desk. I opened the vendor confirmation I'd been waiting for. I responded to it. And that evening, at my kitchen table in the Midtown apartment, I opened a manila folder in the bottom drawer of my home desk, and I added a printed copy of my father's 4-sentence email to the documents already inside it. The conversation that broke everything open happened on a Tuesday. I had gone to Dale's office, a repurposed storage room off the main corridor of the Elk Grove office, with a window that looked onto the parking lot, to ask about correcting a payroll error on one of my regional reports. His monitor was angled away from the door, but when I knocked and he looked up, his expression shifted in a way I had learned to read in 9 years of watching people react to my presence in rooms where they hadn't expected me. It was the expression of someone who had something open on their screen that they would prefer I hadn't walked close enough to see. He closed 2 windows quickly. Not quickly enough. I didn't say anything. I sat down across from him and explained the payroll question I had come in with, and I watched him answer it with the focused pleasantness of someone grateful for the redirect. When I left his office, my hands were steady and my voice was steady, and my stomach felt like I had swallowed a length of cold pipe. What I had seen, in the 2 seconds before the windows closed, were 2 compensation summary columns. I had seen my name in one column. I had seen Beau's name in the other. I am not going to describe what I did with that information for the next 72 hours as though it was strategic. It wasn't. I went home to my apartment in Midtown, a two-bedroom I had moved into 3 years ago when my rent in East Sac got reclassified to something I would not have been able to afford on the salary I was about to discover I was earning, and I sat with it. I ran numbers. I thought about the Yolo County contract and the Sacramento Delta portfolio and the 18 months I had spent redesigning the West Sacramento warehouse's receiving process after the old system caused us to lose $12,000 in spoiled seed stock over a single summer. I thought about the org chart that the company was still growing into. I thought about the 4-sentence email my father had sent while I was on a call presenting work that now required my brother's review. Then I went back to Dale. I went on a Thursday morning early before most of the Elk Grove office had come in. I had a legal pad with me, which was a habit I'd developed for client meetings, and I set it on the corner of his desk and told him I needed to review my compensation documentation. Not ask. Tell. I kept my voice even when I said it. Dale was quiet for a moment. He looked at the legal pad. He looked at me. Presley, he said and stopped. I've been with this company for 9 years, I said. I'd like to see my current compensation documentation and any adjustment history. He said that was a reasonable request. He pulled it up. He turned the monitor toward me, and when he did, he kept his eyes on the parking lot window, which I understood as the closest thing to decency the situation allowed him. The number I saw was not a surprise, exactly. It was a confirmation of something I had already calculated in the rough, sitting at my kitchen table 2 nights before. But confirmation has a weight that estimation doesn't. The cold pipe feeling came back, this time in my chest. I asked him to pull Colton's record. He said he wasn't sure he was authorized to do that. I said I would make it easy for him and write down what I already knew from the window I'd seen 2 days ago, and he could confirm or correct the number. He didn't correct it. I wrote down Bo's estimate next. He looked at the parking lot for a long time. That one's close, he said finally. I wrote the number down on the legal pad. I put a circle around it. I set the pen down and looked at what I had in front of me, 3 rows. 9 years of institutional knowledge, the 3 largest accounts in the company's portfolio, and the redesigned West Sacramento receiving process in the first row. 3 years and a title placement in the second. 22 months and a senior title with accounts I had helped onboard in the third. The gap between my row and my brother's rows was not a rounding error. It was not an administrative oversight that had accumulated across annual reviews. It was a decision, made and remade, year over year, and it was large enough that I sat with the legal pad in my lap for a moment before I trusted myself to stand up without my knees registering anything visible. I thanked Dale. I meant it genuinely. He had given me what I needed in the only way available to him, and I understood that. I folded the legal pad under my arm and walked out of his office and down the corridor toward the main stairwell, and I did not think about where I was going until I was already on the 2nd floor, standing in front of my father's office door. Wade Calloway kept his office the way he kept his public persona. Orderly on the surface, everything with a designated place, nothing that didn't signal something intentional. The Sacramento Valley through the south-facing window, framed like an asset. A framed photo of the original Elk Grove building on the wall behind his desk, the one with the hand-painted sign, the one he pointed to when he told the founding story. 2 leather chairs opposite his desk that no one sat in for informal conversations because they were positioned too far from his desk for anything to feel informal. He was on a call when I opened the door. He held up one finger without looking at me. I sat in one of the leather chairs and waited. I set the legal pad on the arm of the chair. I looked at the Sacramento Valley through the south-facing window and thought about the Yolo County Cooperative and the irrigation pump and the stranger's truck on Highway 113, and I let the wait be what it was. He finished the call. He set the phone down and looked at me with the expression he used for scheduling conflicts, mildly inconvenienced, already moving past it. I've been reviewing compensation, I said. I want to talk about the gap between my salary and Colton's and Bo's. Something moved across his face. Not surprise. Something more like the look of a man who has been anticipating a conversation for a long time and is now adjusting to the fact that it has arrived in a form he didn't choreograph. That's an HR matter, he said. I spoke with HR, I said. Now I'm speaking with you. He leaned back in his chair. He was 63 years old, and he had the posture of a man who had never been required to make himself smaller in a room. He pressed his fingertips together. He looked at the legal pad on the arm of my chair. Presley, he said, compensation is based on a lot of factors. I manage 3 accounts that represent 41% of our current annual revenue, I said. I coordinated the West Sacramento receiving redesign. I closed Yolo County. I want to understand what factors produce a base salary that is, I glanced at the legal pad, though I didn't need to, 53% of what Bo is currently earning. The number sat in the room between us. He didn't reach for it. He let it sit there, and the way he let it sit there told me he already knew it. Had always known it. Bo has a senior title, he said. A title I was passed over for, I said. At the time you called it a strategic hire. Colton has seniority. By 3 years in a different department. My father unfolded his hands. He set them flat on the desk. This was a gesture I had watched him use in vendor negotiations, the physical signal that the conversation had moved past its preliminary phase and he was now going to say the actual thing. They're men, he said. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. They have families to provide for. You! He paused, and the pause had weight in it, the weight of something he had thought before and was now simply choosing to say, You waste money, Presley. You spend it. They build with it. The window behind him held the valley. I heard, distantly, a delivery truck in the parking lot below. The idle of the engine, the particular pitch of it. I didn't answer him right away. I counted the pause instead of answering it. I see, I said. It's not personal, he said, and the ease with which he said it, the complete, unguarded ease, as though this were an explanation that required no defense, was the thing that clarified everything. I picked up the legal pad. I stood up from the leather chair. My voice was steady when I said the next thing, which was not a question. I quit. He looked at me for a moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Something between amusement and dismissal, the sound of a man entertaining an implausibility. You quit, he repeated. Effective today. He leaned back further. The amusement settled into something more permanent on his face, something that had been waiting behind the other expressions for a long time. Who's going to hire you? He said. I held the legal pad against my side. The diesel smell from the parking lot had reached the second floor. I could smell it through the gap at the bottom of the window. The Sacramento Valley sat in its frame behind my father's head, golden and indifferent and enormous. I walked to the door. I set my hand on the frame. I turned back once, not because I needed to see his face again, but because I wanted the moment to be specific, to have a physical coordinate I could return to later. He was still leaning back in his chair. He was still almost smiling. He looked like a man who expected me to reconsider before I reached the bottom of the stairs. I didn't say anything else. I walked down the stairs and out through the Elk Grove office's main entrance and into the October morning, and the diesel and the Dry Creek dust and the faint rot of the lower parcels hit me all at once, and for the first time in 9 years, none of it smelled like belonging. I had 14 clients' direct contact information in my phone. I had 9 years of institutional knowledge in my head. I had a legal pad with 3 circled numbers under my arm. And somewhere in the back of my mind, before I had even reached my car, before I had decided anything consciously, something had already begun to move. My car was a 6-year-old Subaru Outback the color of dry sage, and I sat in it in the Calloway Agricultural Supply parking lot for 11 minutes without starting the engine. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched the clock on the dash, not because I was waiting for anything specific, but because I needed something to count. The October sun came through the windshield at an angle that put a stripe of warmth across my forearms, and I held the legal pad in my lap and looked at the 3 circled numbers and let the 11 minutes be what they were. Then I started the car and drove to Midtown. There are things I should tell you about the 9 years before that Tuesday in October because they are not incidental context. They are the ledger. And I had been keeping the ledger long before I understood what I was keeping it for. I joined Calloway Agricultural Supply in the spring of my 22nd year, 2 weeks after graduation, because my father had offered me a position in regional account coordination and because I had believed, with the particular sincerity of someone who has watched a thing built from the outside and wants to understand it from the inside, that proximity to the work was the same as belonging to it. My first assigned accounts were the 3 smallest in the Sacramento Delta portfolio. Greenhouse suppliers, mostly. 2 small co-ops in Woodland. A seed distributor in Dixon who had been with the company since the original Elk Grove days and who called my father Wade and called me Wade's girl for the first 8 months until I showed up with a revised pricing structure that saved him $4,000 annually on bulk herbicide orders, after which he called me Presley. That revision had taken me 3 weekends. I had built it in a spreadsheet on my kitchen table using pricing data I requested directly from 2 of our upstream vendors, because no one had given me access to the company's vendor rate database yet, and by the time I got access, I had already reverse-engineered most of it. In my 3rd year, I took over the Sacramento Growers Collective account after the previous coordinator left for a position in Fresno. The collective was not a prestige account. It was a moderate revenue, high-maintenance relationship involving 11 member farms with 11 different equipment preferences and a rotating committee structure that meant every pricing conversation required approximately 3 times as many sign-offs as a standard contract. The previous coordinator had described it, in his farewell email, as a personality-building exercise. What he meant was that it was the account no one wanted. I spent 4 months restructuring the service model. The first thing I did was map the committee's actual decision bottleneck, which turned out not to be the committee itself but the notice period required to get all 11 chairs on a call. 11 farms, 11 schedules, and a rotating chair system that changed quarterly meant the window for any pricing decision involving more than 2 members was approximately 3 weeks, which was 3 weeks longer than any equipment availability problem could afford to wait. I charted the previous 18 months of booking requests against the committee's response times and found the pattern inside of a weekend. 63% of late deliveries traced directly to the approval lag window. The remaining 37% were standard lead time issues the new system could absorb. I built a tiered scheduling model. Standard orders, equipment valued under a threshold I set after reading 3 years of the collective's booking history, could be placed directly by individual member farms without committee review. Non-standard orders, anything above the threshold or involving equipment shared across 3 or more farms simultaneously, still routed through the committee. The model reduced the coordination overhead by roughly 60%. More importantly, from the collective's perspective, it made them feel less like they were waiting for permission every time they needed a tractor in the ground. I presented it to the committee chair at the time, a weathered man named Roger who had been farming the eastern parcels of the Sacramento Delta for 30 years and who had, in our first meeting, asked me how old I was with the specific tone of a man who had already decided the answer was not enough. I presented it to him in his farm office, which smelled of soil and a particular brand of hand cleaner, and I walked him through the tier structure with a printed summary I had brought because I had learned that printed summaries in that setting carried more authority than a laptop screen. He asked 5 questions. I answered 4 of them immediately. The 5th, about liability coverage for direct bookings, I told him I would have in writing by end of week, and I did. The committee approved the model in 30 days. Revenue from the collective account grew by 31% in the following fiscal year. My father mentioned it at the next all-hands meeting in a sentence that began, "The collective numbers are looking better," and ended there. I'm telling you this not because I need you to know I was good at the job. I'm telling you because of what I did the summer before my 5th year, which is when I first understood something about the company that I had not previously allowed myself to articulate. I had requested, for the 3rd consecutive year, a meeting to discuss my compensation review. The first year, the meeting had been rescheduled twice and then summarized in an email that described my performance as strong and increased my salary by 2%, which was the company-wide standard adjustment. The second year, the meeting had happened, but my father had spent the majority of it describing the company's growth challenges in the Delta region, and by the end I had somehow agreed to take on the West Sacramento coordination work on a temporary basis that lasted until I quit. The third year, the meeting didn't happen at all. I received the standard 2% email and a handwritten note from my father on Calloway stationery that said, "Good work this year, President. Keep it up." I kept the note. I don't know exactly why I kept it. I wasn't building a case, not consciously, but I put it in a manila folder in the bottom drawer of my home desk with 2 other documents: a copy of the email announcing Bo's senior account manager hire, and a printout of the Yolo County cooperative contract with my name in the originating coordinator field. The West Sacramento warehouse redesign deserves more than the summary it usually gets when I tell this story, because the summary makes it sound like a systems problem I solved cleanly, and it wasn't clean, and the part that wasn't clean is the part that matters. The warehouse in West Sacramento was the company's highest throughput facility. The most equipment moving through it per quarter, the most complex receiving schedule, the most exposure to the kind of cascading delay where one late delivery created 4 problems downstream. It was also the facility with the oldest receiving process, a paper-based intake system that dated from the early 2000s and that the facility manager, a compact, territorial man named Garrett, defended with the specific intensity of someone who had never been asked to justify it and had therefore never examined whether it was worth justifying. I came into the West Sacramento coordination role in my 6th year, on the temporary basis I mentioned, with no formal authority over Garrett and no addition to my compensation to reflect the scope of what I was being asked to do. My mandate, as my father described it, was to help Garrett optimize the flow. What this meant in practice was that I attended receiving meetings where Garrett's system was treated as given and I was expected to work around it rather than through it. In the summer of my 6th year, the warehouse lost $12,000 in spoiled seed stock over an 11-week period. The losses were the direct result of a receiving documentation error, incoming stock logged against the wrong inventory codes, which meant the affected seed batches sat in general storage rather than climate-controlled receiving for an average of 6 days longer than they should have. The error was systematic, not accidental. The coding system Garrett used had a category overlap that anyone who had mapped it against the vendor manifests would have identified immediately, except that no one had mapped it against the vendor manifests, because the paper intake system and the digital inventory system had grown independently over 8 years and had never been formally reconciled. I asked Garrett, in a June meeting with 4 other people in the room, whether we could look at the category coding against the vendor manifests. He said the system had worked fine for 8 years. I said the system had produced $12,000 in spoiled stock in 11 weeks. He said receiving was a complex operation and losses were part of the business. I said I understood that and asked again whether we could look at the coding. He looked at me the way men in that setting sometimes looked at me, not with overt hostility, but with the specific blankness of someone who has decided that what is happening in front of them is not a real thing, not a real conversation, not a real challenge worth engaging with. Then he looked at the other 4 people in the room, 2 of whom were men who reported to him and 2 of whom were coordinators from other facilities, and he said, "We'll circle back on that." We did not circle back on that. I drove to the West Sacramento warehouse on a Saturday in August. Not a workday, a Saturday, when the facility was running a partial crew for a scheduled inbound shipment, and I asked the receiving supervisor on duty if I could spend a few hours in the intake staging area watching the process run. He was a younger man named Trevor who had been with the facility for 2 years and who did not seem to have strong opinions about whether someone with a clipboard wanted to stand near the loading dock and make notes. I told him I was looking at the flow for a process review. He said sure. I spent 4 hours watching how stock moved from the loading dock to the staging lanes to the intake logging station, and I took notes on every step, and by the end of the 4 hours I had identified 3 specific points in the process where the category overlap produced incorrect coding. Points that were not visible from a systems-level review because they only appeared in the transition between the paper manifest and the digital entry, a handoff that happened at a specific moment in the intake sequence that you had to be physically present to see. I drove home. I built a reconciliation document that Sunday, a mapping of the vendor manifest categories against the warehouse's intake codes, with the 3 overlap points flagged and a proposed coding adjustment that would eliminate the ambiguity. It was 14 pages. I had done it using the vendor manifests I'd requested access to over the preceding month, which Garrett had not known I was collecting, because I had requested them through the vendor relationship side of my account coordinator role rather than through the warehouse operations channel he would have monitored. I brought the 14-page document to the next all-hands facilities meeting in September and presented it to the room, which included Garrett and my father and 2 operations managers from the other facilities. I kept my voice level when Garrett said the proposed adjustment would require retraining the full intake team. I said I understood, and that I had drafted a training outline, which was the second document I removed from the folder I had brought. I set it on the table beside the reconciliation document, and I let both of them sit there and be read. My father looked at the reconciliation document for a moment. Then he looked at Garrett. "How long to implement?" he said. It was the first time in 3 facilities meetings that the conversation had moved past Garrett's first objection. Something in the room shifted. Not dramatically, a degree or two, the angle of light through a window when a cloud moves past it. But the shift was real. Garrett said 6 weeks. It took 9. The intake team required more retraining than the outline projected, because the paper-to-digital handoff point was a deeply habitual behavior, and habits take longer to replace than procedures. I drove to West Sacramento every Tuesday and Thursday during the implementation period, in addition to my regular account coordination work, without additional compensation. I sat with Trevor in the staging area and watched the new process run and tracked where it was producing friction and adjusted the training documentation 3 times. In the 2 years after the redesign's implementation, 0 losses from category coding errors. 0. My father mentioned the West Sacramento receiving numbers at one all-hands meeting, in the context of a broader operational summary, in a sentence that attributed the improvement to facility-level process work. Garrett was in the room. I was also in the room. I drove home that evening and I did not say anything to anyone about it, because I had learned by then that saying something to someone about it was not a form of relief that was available to me in that company. I sat at my kitchen table and I opened the manila folder and I looked at the handwritten note and the Bow Hire email and the Yolo County contract, and I thought about the phrase facility-level process work and what it contained and what it chose not to contain. Then I added a 1-page summary of the redesign, timeline, scope, documented outcome to the folder. Not because I thought I would need it. Because the instinct to count had become, by then, its own kind of discipline. That folder is what I reached for when I got home from the Elk Grove office on the day I quit. I sat down at my kitchen table in the Midtown apartment and I pulled open the bottom drawer of my desk, and I reached in past the hanging files and I took out the manila folder and I set it on the table in front of me. The handwritten note was on top. "Good work this year, President. Keep it up." The Calloway stationery had a wheat stalk watermark that I had always thought was a reasonable design choice, the kind of thing that communicated something without overstating it. I looked at it for a moment. I looked at the Bow Hire email beneath it, and the Yolo County contract beneath that, and the West Sacramento redesign summary, and the printed copy of the 4-sentence email my father had sent while I was on a call with the collective. Then I opened my laptop. I want to be precise about what I was doing in the 3 weeks after I quit, because imprecision here would misrepresent it. I was not, in any organized sense, executing a plan. I was doing what I had always done when a system produced an output that didn't match its stated inputs. I was counting. I had 14 clients' direct contact information in my phone. 14 was the number I had arrived at in the parking lot, sitting with the legal pad, not as a strategy but as an inventory. The same instinct that had made me track the collective's committee structure in a spreadsheet before anyone asked me to. Of the 14, 7 were accounts I had built from initial contact. 4 were accounts I had inherited and restructured. 3 were accounts where my relationship with the primary contact had, over time, become the primary relationship, meaning that if you asked the contact who they called when something went wrong at Calloway Agricultural Supply, the answer was my cell phone number, not the company's main line. In the first week after I quit, I did not contact any of them. I had reasons for this that were partly ethical. I had not signed a non-solicitation agreement, because Calloway Agricultural Supply had never required them from family employees on the apparent assumption that family was its own binding contract, but I wanted the separation between my exit and any future conversation to be clean enough that it could not be characterized as poaching, and partly practical. I needed something to offer before I made any call. On the 3rd day after I quit, I met with a business attorney in Sacramento. Her name was Priya, and she had a small practice in a suite on Capitol Mall that smelled of good coffee and the particular focused quiet of an office where people came in with urgent problems and expected direct answers. I had found her through a referral from a vendor contact who had navigated a non-compete situation 2 years prior, and I had called her the morning after I quit, which tells you something about how clearly I had been thinking even before I consciously acknowledged that I was thinking clearly. She asked me about the non-solicitation agreement first. I told her there wasn't one. She asked me to confirm that no employment contract I had signed contained any post-termination restriction on client contact. I said I had never signed an employment contract with Calloway Agricultural Supply. I had started as a family hire, on a handshake and a starting salary my father had named at a dinner table, and no contract had ever been put in front of me. She wrote something. She told me that family hire employees without executed agreements were in the most defensible position for post-departure client contact, provided the contact came after a reasonable separation period and did not involve the use of proprietary information. I asked her what constituted a reasonable separation period. Reasonable is a fact-intensive question, she said. In your industry, for a family company departure, I'd say 7 to 14 days. I noted that. She asked about my use of client data, specifically whether I intended to use any contact lists or internal records from my employment. I told her that what I had was the direct contact information of people I had worked with personally for up to 7 years, stored in a phone I owned and updated at my own initiative. She said that was different from a proprietary client database and that the distinction would hold under scrutiny. I thanked her. I paid her invoice before I left the building. What I had at the end of week 1 was a business registration for a supply chain consultancy I incorporated under a name I chose for its plainness, Cascadia Agricultural Partners. I had a Sacramento business address, a registered agent service on K Street, $42 a month, and a basic website I built myself using a template, which was functional without being impressive, which was the correct approach for the moment. I had a rate structure I had built based on 3 years of watching what our vendor margins actually looked like, which gave me a pricing model that could undercut Callaway's service fees by 18% on standard equipment coordination while remaining profitable if I kept overhead minimal. I also had, at the end of week 1, a voicemail from my brother Colton. I listened to it twice. His voice had the particular quality it got when he was performing reasonableness. Slightly slower than his natural cadence, the pauses placed with care. Presley, hey. Dad mentioned you'd left the company. I just wanted to reach out and say, look, I don't know exactly what happened, but if you need a reference or anything, I'm happy to put in a word. You did good work. I hope there's no hard feelings. I did not call him back. I set the phone down on the kitchen table next to the manila folder and I let the voicemail be what it was. 3 days later, my mother called. My mother's name is Delilah. She had not worked at Calloway Agricultural Supply in any formal capacity. She had been, for most of my childhood, the person who managed the household and the family's social calendar and the particular work of keeping Wade Calloway's public persona consistent with his private one, which was a form of labor that went entirely unaccounted for in any ledger I had access to. She had opinions about the company the way she had opinions about weather. Generally accurate, rarely acted upon, delivered with a kind of resigned certainty. She called on a Wednesday afternoon. I was on my second cup of coffee and a vendor rate spreadsheet. Your father says you walked out, she said. I resigned, I said. He says you're being dramatic. I wrote a number in the spreadsheet. I'm starting a consultancy. There was a pause on her end. Not the pause of someone processing new information, the pause of someone who had been given a script and was deciding how closely to follow it. Presley, you know your father built that company for all of you. Walking out doesn't. Mom, I said. He told me I waste money. Silence. He told me Colton and Bo deserve more because they're men, I said. He said it plainly. In his office. On a Tuesday morning. Another pause. Longer. He has a way of saying things, she said finally, and her voice had dropped into something quieter, something I recognized as the register she used when she was telling the truth without committing to it. I know he does, I said. The call ended shortly after that. Not badly, there was no argument, no door-slamming equivalent over the phone. We said goodbye the way we always said goodbye, which was with a warmth that sat just above the surface of everything that wasn't being said. I set the phone down. I looked at the spreadsheet. I didn't fill the silence she left behind. The second cruelty came 12 days after I quit, and it came from a direction I should have anticipated but hadn't, which is the thing about secondary strikes. They arrive from the angle you left unguarded because you were watching the primary front. I was in a meeting with a potential new client, a mid-sized organic operation out of Yolo County, not the cooperative, a different outfit that had been referred to me by a former vendor contact, when my phone buzzed 3 times in quick succession. I kept it face down on the table and finished the meeting, which went well. The operations owner was a practical woman named Sandra, who had strong opinions about equipment lead times and no patience for service coordinators who treated her like a small account, and we understood each other within the first 15 minutes. I walked out to my car and picked up the phone. The 3 messages were from a contact I still had in my phone under her work title, Calloway Ag Supply Accounts. Her name was Renata, and she had been with the company for 6 years in a client-facing support role, and she was one of approximately 4 people in the Elk Grove office I would have described, without hesitation, as genuinely good at their job. The messages read, in order. Presley, I don't know if I should be sending this, but I thought you should know. Your dad sent an email to the full client list this morning. Regional accounts. All of them. I'm so sorry. I sat in the car. The October sun had the same angle as it had in the parking lot 11 days ago, the same stripe across the forearms. I called Renata. She picked up on the second ring, and I could hear from her voice that she was somewhere she thought she wasn't being listened to, a bathroom, maybe, or the stairwell. He sent an email, she said before I could say anything, to all the regional account contacts. It went out at 8 this morning under his signature. What did it say? She read it to me. She read it carefully, which told me she had read it enough times to have it close to memorized. The email informed the regional account contacts that Presley Calloway had chosen to leave the company to pursue personal matters, and that her accounts had been redistributed to the existing team. It expressed confidence in the continuity of service. It included, in the 3rd paragraph, a line I will quote here because precision matters. As a family business, we maintain the highest standards of professional conduct, and we're grateful for clients who share those values. The 4th paragraph named Colton as the new primary contact for the Sacramento Delta portfolio. I let Renata finish. My voice was steady when I said, "Thank you for telling me." "There's something else," she said. I waited. He called Yolo County Cooperative himself. Yesterday. Before the email went out. She paused. He told them that you had left due to a conduct issue. The stripe of sun on my forearms. He said conduct issue specifically, I said. That's the phrase Darnell used when he called me, she said. Darnell was the cooperative's operations manager, and Darnell had apparently called Renata because Darnell and Renata had worked together on a joint equipment lease 3 years ago, and Darnell trusted her in the way that people trust the person they actually dealt with rather than the name on the letterhead. He said your dad called him personally. He said he wanted to give them a heads up as a long-standing client. I looked at the Yolo County Cooperative contract in my mind. The 7 months, the Saturday with the irrigation pump, the stranger's truck on Highway 113. I looked at my name in the originating coordinator field. Darnell said he didn't believe it, Renata added. For whatever that's worth. It's worth something, I said. After I hung up, I sat in the car for a moment. The engine wasn't running. The parking lot of the organic operations office was quiet. A few trucks, a stack of irrigation pipe along the fence line, a blackbird working at something near the drain at the lot's edge. A conduct issue. He hadn't just lowered my salary. He hadn't just replaced me. He had reached into the 9 years and put a name on them that he had chosen himself, and he had sent it out under his signature before I had made a single call to a single client, which meant he knew what he was doing and had moved first. I drove home. I sat down at the kitchen table. I opened the manila folder that had been living on the corner of my desk for 11 days, and I reached past the handwritten note and the Bow Hire email and the West Sacramento redesign summary, and I took out the Yolo County contract. I smoothed it flat on the table. I looked at the date in the upper right corner, and I looked at my name in the originating coordinator field, and I looked at the 2-year term and the dollar figure in the service agreement section, and I thought about what a conduct issue meant in practical terms, what it did to a professional reputation in an industry that was, at the regional level, genuinely small, genuinely relational, genuinely dependent on the kind of trust that took years to build and could be damaged in a single phone call from a man with 30 years of relationships and a company letterhead. Then I reached for my laptop and opened a new document and began to type. Not a rebuttal. Not a letter to my father. A timeline. Dated entries, sourced where possible, descriptive where not. The Yolo County Cooperative from first contact to contract signing. The collective restructure. The West Sacramento receiving redesign and the $12,000 in spoiled seed stock it had prevented. The 3 consecutive compensation review requests. The handwritten note. The Bo hire email. The 4-sentence email sending my collective pricing changes to Colton's review queue. Renata's account of the phone call to Darnell. The email my father had sent that morning to the full regional account list. I typed for 2 hours. By the time I stopped, the document was 14 pages. I saved it. I closed the laptop. I looked at the manila folder on the table and at the Yolo County contract still smoothed flat beside it. And then my phone lit up with a number I recognized but hadn't expected. A 530 area code, a Woodland Exchange, a contact I had listed simply as Dixon Seed Marcus. Marcus was the seed distributor from Dixon who had called me Wade's girl for 8 months. He had received my father's email. I looked at the phone. I looked at the timeline document on my closed laptop. I looked at the Yolo County contract. I picked up. Marcus didn't lead with the email. That was the first thing I noticed. He said hello the way he always said hello, which was without preamble, the greeting of a man who considered small talk a form of disrespect toward the other person's time. He asked if I had a few minutes. I said I did. I heard him shift in his chair, the particular creak of the old wooden office chair he kept behind the counter at the Dixon operation, which I knew because I had sat across from it 11 times in 3 years. Got an email from your father this morning, he said. I know, I said. I heard. Conduct issue, he said. The phrase sat between us for a moment. That's a specific thing to say about someone. It is, I said. I've been doing business with Calloway since before you were there, he said. 11 years. In that time, I've dealt with 4 different coordinators. You were the only one who ever showed up in person when I had a problem that wasn't technically your problem to solve. I thought about the bulk herbicide revision. 3 weekends. My kitchen table. The vendor rate database I had reverse engineered before I had access to it. I appreciated working with you, Marcus, I said. I'm not calling to reminisce, he said. I'm calling because I want to know if you're going to keep doing this work somewhere else. Because if you are, I'd like to know where. I looked at the Yolo County contract still flat on the table beside me. I've started a consultancy, I said. Cascadia Agricultural Partners. I'm not in a position to make a formal pitch tonight, but I can send you information this week. Send it tomorrow, he said. I've got a board call Thursday. We said goodbye. I set the phone down. I looked at the blackbird that was still visible through the window, working at the same patch of ground it had been working at when I was sitting in the parking lot across town, which was not possible because I was now in Midtown and it was a different blackbird, but the mind does that, in the hours after something shifts. It finds continuity where there isn't any because continuity is easier to hold than the alternative. I opened my laptop. I began building the pitch document for Cascadia Agricultural Partners. The call from Colton came 4 days later. Not the performative reasonableness voicemail from the week before, a direct call mid-morning on a Thursday which was unusual enough in its timing that I picked up before I had decided whether I wanted to. Dad's talking about suing you, Colton said. I set down the mug I was holding. For what? Tortious interference. He thinks you're poaching clients. I had sent the Cascadia Agricultural Partners information document to Marcus. I had sent a brief professional update. Not a pitch, an update, 3 sentences stating that I had started a consultancy and was available if they ever wanted to discuss their service needs, to 4 other contacts whose relationships I had built from initial outreach and who I believed had the right to know I was still in the industry. I had done this 11 days after my resignation. I had not signed a non-solicitation agreement. I had spoken with Priya on day 3 after quitting, specifically about this question, and she had been clear. There's no basis for that, I said. I know there's probably no basis, Colton said, and his voice had shifted away from the performed reasonableness into something that might have been its actual register, slightly tired, slightly impatient with the position he'd been placed in. "I'm telling you what he's saying. He's angry, Presley. The Dixon account called to restructure their contract terms this week. Marcus had moved fast. I hadn't known that yet." "That's Marcus's business decision," I said. "Dad doesn't see it that way." "What does Dad see it as?" A pause. "He says you're trying to burn the company down on your way out." I picked the mug back up. The coffee had gone cold. "I've spoken to 5 clients in 11 days, Colton. 4 of them were relationships I originated. I'm not burning anything down. I'm doing what any professional does when they leave a position." "Yeah, well." He exhaled. "Look, I'm not calling to argue the merits. I'm calling because Mom asked me to. She thinks if you just talk to him, maybe take a few weeks, he might." "He told me I waste money," I said. "He told me, Bo, and you earn more because you're men." He said it in his office with the door closed and no one else in the room, and then he sent a conduct issue email to my entire client list before I had made a single call. "I'm not taking a few weeks." Silence on Colton's end. "I know," he said. Quietly enough that I almost asked him to repeat it. "I know he said something. I'm not saying he was right." "But you're not saying he was wrong either," I said. He didn't answer that. The call ended the way the call with my mother had ended. Without resolution, without raised voices, with a warmth at the edges that was the Calloway family's specific mode of not addressing the thing that needed addressing. I set the phone down. I didn't call him back. I finished building the Cascadia pitch document, which was now 22 pages and included a service model, a tiered pricing structure, 3 case study summaries with identifying details removed, and a 1-page biography that listed 9 years at Calloway Agricultural Supply without editorializing about any of it. I sent it to Marcus that afternoon. I sent a version of it to 3 other contacts by end of week. My father called on a Monday. I want to be precise about this because precision matters here. He called me. I did not seek out the confrontation. I had been, in the 17 days since I had walked out of his office, methodical and quiet and careful, and I had not called him once, and when his name appeared on my phone screen on a Monday morning at 10:47, I had a choice about whether to answer it. I answered it. "I want to meet," he said. No greeting. The voice of a man who had decided something. "In person." "The Elk Grove office." "I'll come to Elk Grove," I said. "Not the office. There's a place on Laguna that has outside seating." A pause. He didn't like the counter. I heard it in the silence, the brief recalibration of a man who had expected the home field concession. "Fine," he said. We met on a Tuesday. The weather had shifted since October. A marine layer had come in off the coast and settled over the valley, the kind of low gray ceiling that flattened the light and made everything look like it was waiting for something. I got there first and chose a table with my back to the building and a clear sight line to the parking lot entrance, which was not a strategic decision so much as a habit from years of client meetings where I'd learned that the person who arrives first chooses the geometry. My father came in from the parking lot in the jacket he wore to vendor meetings. Dark canvas, Calloway Ag Supply logo on the chest, the logo that I had helped redesign in my 4th year at the company because the original looked like it had been traced from a seed catalog. He sat down across from me without removing it. We ordered coffee. The server left. "You've contacted my clients," he said. "I've contacted clients I developed professional relationships with over 9 years," I said. "Several of them reached out to me first. That's not how I'd characterize it." "I know," I said. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. He had large hands, the hands of someone who had done physical work before the work became managerial, and the gesture made him look momentarily like a different version of himself, the one from the Elk Grove founding photo with the hand-painted sign. "You want to talk about what happened in my office," he said. "I want to talk about 9 years of compensation that doesn't reflect 9 years of contribution," I said. "And I want to talk about a conduct issue email that went to my full client list before I'd made a single professional contact." His jaw tightened. I informed clients of a staffing change. You told Yolo County Cooperative there was a conduct issue, I said. That's not informing. That's defaming. The words sat on the table between us. He looked at me for a moment. Really looked, the way he hadn't in his office, the way he almost never did, and I held his gaze and let my voice stay where it was, which was level. That's a serious accusation, he said. It's an accurate description, I said. He set the cup down. He leaned back in the outdoor chair, which had a slight give to it, and the give seemed to irritate him. He was a man who preferred furniture that didn't move. Presley. His voice changed registers. Not softer exactly, but recalibrated, the way it recalibrated in vendor negotiations when the opening position hadn't landed. You're my daughter. That company has your name on it. I built it for all three of you. You built it, I said. And I ran 41% of its current revenue. And you paid me 53% of what Bo earns. And when I asked you why, you told me it was because I waste money and they're men. I paused. So let's talk about what you built it for. His eyes hardened. I had seen that look at vendor tables, at bank meetings, at the dinner where he'd announced Bo's hire while I was still processing the Yolo County contract. It was the look of a man who had confused being unchallenged with being right. The compensation was appropriate for your role, he said. My role included work that wasn't in my job description, I said. The West Sacramento coordination. The collective restructure. 3 years of compensation review requests that produced 2% adjustments and 1 handwritten note. You were compensated. Wade. I used his name. I had not used his name in approximately a decade of professional interactions with my own father. I watched the flicker of it cross his face, surprise, then something that rearranged itself quickly into something harder. I have the numbers. I have the dates. I have documentation of every account I originated and every structural change I implemented. I have the compensation records Dale pulled. I have your email to the client list, and I have Darnell's account of the phone call you made to Yolo County Cooperative the day before that email went out. And I have the email you sent to the regional team 3 weeks ago routing my collective pricing work through Colton's review. A pause. The marine layer sat above us, even and gray. You talked to Dale, he said. Dale was doing his job, I said. Dale is an employee of this company, he snapped. The theatrical register arrived in his voice. Not a shout, but the sharp, pressurized quality of a man who was accustomed to his anger having a contracting effect on rooms. He had no business sharing internal compensation records with the employee they belonged to, I said. My voice stayed where it was. He stopped. The anger compressed into something colder. What exactly do you want? He said. Is this about money? You want a settlement? You want back pay? What is this? I want you to retract the conduct issue statement, I said. In writing to Yolo County Cooperative and to anyone else you communicated it to. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he made the sound, the one from his office, the one that wasn't quite a laugh. Less amused this time. More dismissive. I'm not retracting anything, he said. You walked out of a family business, Presley. You walked out of something I built for 30 years, and now you're sitting across from me at a coffee table threatening me with documentation. You know what I think. He leaned forward slightly, and his voice dropped into the register it used when he wanted something to land permanently. You always thought you deserved more than you earned. That's been your problem from the beginning. And I think when the people you've been calling start to see that, they'll come back to the company that's been serving them for a decade instead of chasing whatever you're building out of spite. I looked at him. The marine layer light made everything flat and precise, no shadows, nothing softened. He was 63 years old and he was completely certain. The way he had been completely certain in his office when he told me I wasted money. The way he had been completely certain at every dinner table and vendor meeting and all hands where the story of what the company was and who built it had been told in a version that had no room for a 41% revenue contribution from a daughter who wasn't supposed to count. I didn't answer him. I picked up my coffee cup. I set it back down. I smoothed the edge of my jacket hem where it had ridden up on the chair arm, a small, deliberate gesture, hands occupied, body still. Then my phone buzzed once on the table between us. I looked at it. A text from a number I had saved under a name I had not expected to hear from. A name that had nothing to do with Calloway Agricultural Supply, a name that connected not to my 9 years at the company but to something older, something that predated my employment, something that I had put in a separate compartment of my memory because it had seemed, until this moment, unrelated to everything that was currently in motion. The text said 4 words. Call me. It's time. My father was still talking. I could hear his voice continuing. The shape of it, the cadence, but the specific words had stopped registering because I was looking at those 4 words on my phone screen and understanding, for the first time, that the ledger I had been keeping was not the only ledger that had been kept. He said, "Who's going to take you seriously when you couldn't even hold a position in your own family's company?" My father was still talking. I set the phone face down on the table. I looked at him and let him finish the sentence he was in the middle of. Something about reputation, about what it meant to walk away from something that had your name on it, and when he stopped, I looked at him for a moment with the marine layer light making everything flat and exact between us. "I have to make a call," I said. "I'll be in touch about the retraction." He opened his mouth. I stood up, picked up the phone, left 2 20s on the table for the coffees, and walked to the parking lot without looking back. Behind me, I heard the outdoor chair shift. The sound of him standing, the sound of a man who had not expected the conversation to end on someone else's timing. I got to my car. I sat down. I turned the phone over. "Call me. It's time." The contact name was Magnolia. My grandmother on my mother's side had been dead for 4 years. Her name had been Magnolia Pruitt before she married, and she had kept the name as her first name the way women of her generation sometimes did in the part of Louisiana she came from, carrying it west when she followed my grandfather to Sacramento in 1971 and keeping it there the way you keep something that was yours before anything else was. She had been 78 when she died, sharp until the last 8 months, and she had loved me with the specific, uncomplicated intensity of someone who had watched the family's internal architecture clearly enough to understand what it cost the people it wasn't built for. The contact in my phone was not my grandmother. It was her attorney. His name was Gerald Foss. He had a practice in East Sacramento, a small suite on Folsom Boulevard that smelled of old paper and the particular dust of files that don't move often, and I had met him exactly once, 7 years ago, when my grandmother was still alive and had asked me to come to his office on a Thursday afternoon without telling me why. I had gone. We had sat in his conference room, the 3 of us. Gerald at the head of the table, my grandmother in the chair to his left, and me across from her, and my grandmother had held a cup of tea she didn't drink, and Gerald Foss had explained, in the measured cadence of a man who had constructed documents for a long time, that my grandmother had updated her estate planning and wanted me to understand one element of it directly. I had listened. My grandmother had not spoken much during that meeting. She had let Gerald present the legal architecture while she watched my face with the particular attention she brought to things she had thought about for a long time and wanted to see land correctly. I had not entirely understood the significance of what she was telling me, which was that she had designated me as the sole beneficiary of a specific asset she held. Not the house, not the accounts, but a thing she described, in the one sentence she spoke before Gerald took over again, as the thing that was always yours, even before you knew it. I had been 24. I had nodded and thanked her and driven home and filed it in the back of my mind under the category of things that seemed important but had no immediate application. When I got home from that Thursday, I had called her. We talked for an hour. Not about the attorney's office, not about the estate planning, but about the Sacramento Delta in the fall, and whether the liquid amber trees on her street were going early that year, and a book she had been reading that she described as beautifully constructed and deeply wrong about human nature. She had a way of making those 2 things coexist in her assessment of something she loved. I did not ask her what the asset was. I didn't know how to ask without it sounding like the wrong question. And she did not volunteer it because she was Magnolia, and she understood that some things needed to be held in the dark until they were needed. When my grandmother died 4 years ago, her estate had been processed through probate. The house had gone to my mother. The accounts had been distributed per her instructions. Gerald Foss had sent me a letter, which I had received and read and set aside in the same bottom desk drawer as the manila folder, because the asset my grandmother had designated required a trigger condition she had specified in the estate documents, and that condition had not yet been met. The condition was this: the asset transferred to me in full, without restriction, on the date I ceased to be an employee of Calloway Agricultural Supply. I had read that condition 4 years ago, sitting at my kitchen table with Gerald's letter, and I had set the letter in the drawer and closed it and not thought about it directly since. Not because I had forgotten it, but because the trigger condition had seemed, at the time, like a description of a future I was not moving toward. I had been 31 years old, 9 years into the company, and whatever the asset was, it was parked in a conditional future that belonged to a version of my life I had not yet imagined. I sat in the parking lot of the Laguna Cafe with my father's empty outdoor chair still visible through the window, and I called Gerald Foss. He picked up on the second ring. "Presley," he said. "I heard from your mother that you'd left the company. I've been waiting to hear from you." "What is it?" I said. "What did she leave me?" A pause, not hesitation, the pause of a man selecting the right entry point into something he had been holding for 4 years. The marine layer moved above me, slow and gray, the way it moved when it was beginning to thin. "Your grandmother purchased a 15% equity stake in Calloway Agricultural Supply in 2003, he said. "She purchased it directly from your grandfather's estate when the company was still a single-location operation. She paid fair market value at the time, which was documented and recorded. She held that stake quietly for 20 years. It is now yours." The parking lot. The outdoor chair through the window. The marine layer. "No one knew," I said. "It wasn't a question." "Your grandmother was quite specific about discretion," Gerald said. "She felt that if your father knew, he would find a way to diminish it. She was," a brief pause, "not wrong about your father." I thought about what 15% of Calloway Agricultural Supply meant in current terms. I knew the company's revenue figures. I had managed 41% of them. I knew the asset base, the 3 warehouses, the equipment fleet, the client portfolio. I had helped build significant portions of all 3. The 3 warehouses alone in the Sacramento market were not small numbers. 15% of what I knew those figures to be sat somewhere between $1.8 and $2.4 million, depending on how you valued the intangible assets, and the intangible assets, the client relationships, the operational systems, the 9 years of institutional knowledge that lived in people rather than in files, were not small either. "She held it for 20 years, I said. "She did." Gerald's voice was precise and quiet, the voice of a man who understood that the moment he was in required neither speed nor inflation. "She said she bought it because she wanted to make sure you had a foundation that wasn't dependent on anyone deciding you deserved one." Her words from the letter she left with the estate documents. "She said she'd watched the family long enough to know that decisions about what you deserved were going to be made by people who weren't qualified to make them." I held the phone against my ear. Through the cafe window, the outdoor table where I had sat with my father was empty now. Someone had taken the 220s. The chair was at a slight angle from where he had pushed it back. In my chest, something moved that I did not have a name for and did not try to name. "I'll need to come in," I said. "Tomorrow," he said. "I've had the transfer documents prepared since the date of her death. I was waiting for the trigger." I did not go back to the Midtown apartment directly. I drove to the West Sacramento warehouse first. Not inside, I had no access anymore, but I parked on the service road that ran along the building's east side, and I sat with the engine off and the windows down, and I listened to the sounds of the facility in its afternoon rhythm. A forklift working somewhere inside, a compressor cycling on and off, the particular clang of a loading dock door going up. The receiving bay I had redesigned was visible from where I sat. The color-coded staging lanes I had spec'd were painted on the concrete in the same positions I had drawn them on the layout document I had brought to the September all-hands. Yellow for standard intake, blue for climate-controlled, red for equipment returning for service. The expanded turnaround clearance in the primary lane was visible in the way that space is visible when you know what used to be there. The old striping had allowed 14 feet of clearance, which was sufficient for most equipment but not for the larger combine headers that came in during harvest season, and arguing for the additional 6 feet had taken 3 facilities meetings because Garrett had not been willing to concede. in front of other people, that the original clearance spec had been his decision and had been wrong. $12,000 in spoiled seed stock 1 summer before the redesign. 0 in the 2 years after. I looked at the staging lanes for a while. Then I put the car in gear and drove home. Gerald Foss's office on Folsom Boulevard had the old paper smell I remembered from the one prior visit, the smell of a practice that had accumulated decades of files and had not made peace with the digital transition in any complete way, which I had come to understand was a form of professional conservatism rather than technological reluctance. Gerald believed, correctly, that paper was more durable than servers in the specific ways that mattered when a document needed to survive 20 years. And be unambiguous when it arrived. He was a compact man in his late 60s with the careful movements of someone who had spent decades handling things that mattered. He shook my hand at the door with the directness of someone who respected appointments. We sat in the same conference room where I had sat with my grandmother 7 years ago. The table was the same dark wood. The window looked onto the same back parking structure. The chair where my grandmother had sat was empty, which was the fact in the room that required the most management, and I managed it by looking at Gerald and the documents rather than at the chair. He reached into the lateral file cabinet behind him, a large unit for drawers, the kind of cabinet that held the organized weight of a career, and took out a manila envelope. Not thin. The envelope of a document set, thick with the weight of pages that had been prepared and waiting. He set it on the table and unfolded the metal clasp at the top and took out the stack inside. He laid it flat on the table between us, the whole stack for distinct documents, each clipped separately, and I could see, on the top page of the first document, my grandmother's signature. Her handwriting. The particular backward lean of it, the way the capital M in Magnolia slanted left as though heading somewhere it intended to arrive at eventually, on its own terms. I had watched that handwriting sign birthday cards and grocery lists and the letters she sent me during my first year at Cal Poly. Letters that contained observations about things she had read and things she had noticed, and, occasionally, advice delivered so obliquely that I sometimes didn't recognize it as advice until days later, when something she had described crystallized into something I was experiencing. The original purchase agreement from 2003, Gerald said, touching the top document. The ownership record from the county, recorded and filed. The estate designation, naming you as sole beneficiary of this asset, executed 7 years ago at the meeting you attended. And the transfer instrument, which becomes effective upon your signature today. He reached into the envelope again and took out a second, smaller envelope, the kind used for personal correspondence, cream-colored, sealed. He set it on the table beside the document stack. "This is her letter," he said. "She asked that you read it before you signed. She was specific about the order." I looked at the cream envelope. My name was on the front in her handwriting, just Presley, no surname, the way she had always written my name on things that were meant only for me. I opened it. I unfolded the single sheet inside, cream stationery, the same she used for everything, 3 paragraphs in her backward-leaning hand. I am not going to reproduce it here in full. Some things belong only to the people they were written for, and a letter written by a woman who understood the importance of things arriving at the right moment in the right form should be honored by being held, not displayed. But I will tell you that she had written it the year after we sat in this conference room, when she was still entirely herself, and that the letter was unhurried and clear and unsentimentally honest in the way that she was always unhurried and clear and unsentimentally honest. The second paragraph contained a sentence I read twice, and then a third time with my finger under the words. "I watched you work for that company, and I watched them count everything except you, and I decided a long time ago that someone in this family was going to count you correctly." The third paragraph was shorter. It said, "The timing of this was always going to be out of your hands. I'm sorry for that. But the thing itself, the stake, the rights, the tools, those are yours because I chose to make them yours, not because anyone in that company decided you deserved them. I want you to understand the difference. You were always going to earn whatever you built. This is just the foundation they forgot to pour." I set the letter down. Outside the window, a car was pulling into the back parking structure. A pigeon landed on the concrete ledge of the structure's second level and walked a few steps and stopped, considering something. "She never said a word," I said. My voice was not entirely steady when I said it. "She was very deliberate about that," Gerald said. She said the value of it depended on you not knowing. She wanted you to build what you built without the net. She wanted it to be yours because of what you did, not because of what she gave you. He paused. She also said, and this is not in the letter, this is from a conversation we had about a year before she died, that she had watched your father's company carefully enough to know that if you knew about the stake, he would find out, and if he found out before the trigger, he would maneuver around it. She was protecting the instrument as much as she was protecting you. I thought about my grandmother in 2003, writing a check from my grandfather's estate to purchase 15% of a company her son-in-law was building. Writing a check and telling no one. Sitting with that knowledge through 12 years of family dinners and Calloway Agricultural Supply Christmas parties and the all-hands meetings she occasionally attended as a family guest. Sitting with it through my first 9 years at the company, through the collective account and the Yolo County contract and the West Sacramento redesign and the handwritten note and Bo's strategic hire. Sitting with it through her own death, which she had organized carefully enough that the trigger condition and the letter and the document set were all in place before she was gone. I picked up the pen Gerald had set beside the transfer instrument. I signed where he indicated. He signed as witness. He notarized the transfer document with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times and understood that efficiency in this context was its own form of respect, that the moment didn't need ceremony, it needed accuracy. You're a 15% equity shareholder in Calloway Agricultural Supply, he said. Effective today. I looked at the 4 documents on the table. The purchase agreement from 2003, the county ownership record, the estate designation, and the transfer instrument with my signature on it now, and I felt the weight of what she had done with 20 years of patience, which was a weight that pressed down not uncomfortably but unmistakably, the way a hand on a shoulder presses when what it is communicating is presence rather than pressure. What does that mean practically? I said. For the company's operations. Gerald folded his hands on the table. He had the composed manner of a man who had been asked this question many times by people in many different states of readiness for the answer. It means you have minority shareholder rights, he said, including the right to request financial disclosures and accounting records, including the right to be present at any shareholder-level decisions, including, should you choose to pursue it, the right to contest any shareholder action that has materially disadvantaged your equity interest. He let that settle for a moment. Such as, for example, a compensation structure that systematically underpaid the labor of a shareholder-employee relative to non-shareholder employees in comparable roles. I looked at him. Your grandmother, he said, with what I recognized as the closest thing to a smile he was likely to produce in a professional context, was very thorough. Yes, I said. She was. I left his office with a copy of the transfer instrument in the folder under my arm. Gerald kept the originals in the lateral cabinet, where they had been for 4 years, and produced a certified copy for me with the same unhurried efficiency he brought to everything. I thanked him at the door. He said he would be in touch Thursday about next steps. I walked to my car in the back parking structure. The pigeon was gone from the concrete ledge. The afternoon light in Sacramento in late October does a specific thing when the marine layer is thinning. It comes in at a low angle and makes the ordinary surfaces of things briefly significant, the way certain hours of a day will do when you are paying attention to them. I sat in the car for a moment with the folder on the passenger seat and the engine not running and the light doing what it was doing through the windshield. Then I drove home. The kitchen table in the Midtown apartment had accumulated a particular geography by this point in the story. The manila folder was there, the one from the bottom drawer, the handwritten note, the Bo hire email, the Yolo County contract, the West Sacramento redesign summary, the 4-sentence routing email. The legal pad with the 3 circled numbers was there. The 14-page timeline document was there, closed on the laptop. I set the certified copy of the transfer instrument on the table beside the others. 4 documents in a row. Each one a counted thing. Each one a piece of a ledger that had been running in various hands for longer than I had known. I looked at them for a while. The marine layer outside the Midtown window was finally beginning to break. A strip of late afternoon light came through at a low angle and crossed the table and touched the edge of the transfer instrument, the newest document, the one with my signature on it and the date that was today. I watched you work for that company and I watched them count everything except you. I picked up the phone. I called my father. I had considered waiting. There was an argument for another day, another week. Let the transfer settle, let Cascadia develop further, let the situation breathe before introducing this new geometry. But my grandmother's letter was still in the folder Gerald had given me, and the second paragraph was still in my head, and I had never been someone who waited when the counting was done. He picked up on the fourth ring. Presley. Flat. The voice of a man who had decided the Laguna Cafe was the last conversation and was now managing an interruption. I need to tell you something, I said. If this is about the retraction. It's not, I said. I want to talk to you about Grandmother Magnolia's estate. A pause. A different quality of pause than any he had produced in our prior conversations. Not the managed pause of a man deciding how to respond, but the pause of someone who has encountered a category they had not prepared for. A category that didn't fit the frame they'd been operating inside. What about it? He said. She held a 15% equity stake in Calloway Agricultural Supply, I said. She purchased it in 2003 from grandfather's estate when the company was still a single location. The stake transferred to me today as a condition of her estate designation. I am now a minority shareholder in the company you've been running. Silence. Not the managed silences I had been working with for weeks, the silences I chose, the silences I counted instead of filling. This was his silence, unmanaged, the silence of a man who had just had the floor geometry change under him in a way he had not seen coming and could not immediately calculate. That's not possible, he said. Gerald Foss has the purchase agreement, the county ownership record, and the transfer instrument, I said. I signed today. It's recorded. I heard him breathing. A particular quality of breathing, not quite controlled, the breath of someone whose habitual steadiness has encountered a fact it cannot immediately absorb. She never, he stopped. Started again. She never told me. No, I said. She didn't. Another silence. I let it go where it needed to go. I had learned in the preceding weeks that there were silences you were supposed to fill and silences that did their own work if you left them alone, and this was the second kind. 15%, he said, and his voice had a quality I had never heard in it before. Not anger, not dismissal, something more fundamental. The sound of a man recalculating something he thought he had already finished calculating, finding that the inputs had been wrong from the beginning. 15%, I said. Which means I have the right to request full financial disclosures. Which means I have the right to contest compensation structures that materially disadvantaged my equity interest. Which means the conduct issue statement you made to Yolo County Cooperative is now a problem of a different order than it was at the Laguna Cafe. I heard the chair in his home office. I knew he was in his home office from the particular acoustic of the room, the slight echo off the wood floors that I had noticed on every phone call I'd ever taken from that house. I heard him set something down on the desk. A glass, maybe. The weight of it deliberate, the sound of a man needing something to do with his hands. You always thought you deserved more than you earned, he said, and it came out differently than it had at the cafe. Not as the pressurized verdict of a man in full certainty, but as a reflex, the words arriving before the thought had finished forming, the sentence his mouth went to when his certainty needed somewhere to stand while the rest of him caught up. I know you believe that, I said. My voice was steady. You'll have the opportunity to make that argument to Gerald Foss when he contacts you about the shareholder disclosure request, which he'll be doing Thursday. He said nothing. I'll be in touch, Wade, I said. I ended the call. I set the phone on the kitchen table next to the 4 documents, the row of counted things, the ledger laid flat in the October light. The marine layer had finished breaking. Through the window, the liquid amber trees on the Midtown Street had caught the last of the afternoon, and their gold was the particular gold of late October. Not the first gold of the season, which is tentative, but the full gold, the color that knows it is nearly over and has stopped holding anything back. My phone buzzed. A text from a Sacramento number I recognized as Gerald Foss's office line. Thursday confirmed. W. Calloway has been notified by certified mail. Formal disclosure request transmitted. I read it. I set the phone down. Somewhere across Sacramento, in a home office with wood floors and a particular acoustic, my father was holding a certified mail notification from the attorney of a woman he had underestimated for 40 years, and understanding for the first time the full shape of what he was looking at. Gerald Foss sent the formal shareholder disclosure request to Calloway Agricultural Supply on that Thursday morning by certified mail and by email, addressed to my father in his capacity as the company's majority owner and operating officer. The request was 14 pages. I had read a draft of it the evening before at my kitchen table, sitting with the 4 documents still in their row, and I had understood, reading it, that my grandmother had not simply bought a stake in a company. She had bought a set of tools and left them in trust for the moment they would be needed, organized with the same care she brought to everything she had decided mattered, and the moment had arrived on its own schedule, the way she had apparently always believed it would. The request itemized the shareholder rights that transferred with the equity stake. It outlined the legal basis for contesting compensation structures that had materially disadvantaged a shareholder employee. It noted, in the careful language of a man who had been constructing sentences for 40 years and understood that precision was more persuasive than force, that the documented compensation disparity, a base salary representing 53% of a comparably tenured male employee's compensation, in a role managing 41% of the company's current annual revenue, constituted grounds for a formal equity harm claim. It requested full financial disclosures for the preceding 5 years, compensation records, revenue attribution documentation, any board-level or operating officer-level decisions affecting shareholder equity. The request also addressed, in a single paragraph near the end, the conduct issue communication to Yolo County Cooperative, characterizing it as potential tortious interference with the business interests of a minority shareholder and requesting a written retraction within 10 business days. My father received the certified copy on Friday. I know this because Gerald called me Friday afternoon to confirm delivery. He's contacted an attorney, Gerald said. A business litigator in Roseville. I've spoken with her briefly. She's competent, and I think she'll advise him to settle the compensation claim rather than litigate it. And the retraction? I expect you'll have it within the 10-day window, Gerald said. The conduct issue statement is the most legally exposed piece. His attorney will see that clearly. I thanked him. I hung up and stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking at the Midtown street below. A Tuesday quality of afternoon even though it was Friday, the marine layer half present again, the light doing what the light in Sacramento does in late October, which is arrive at angles that make ordinary things look briefly significant. A woman walking a dog. A delivery truck double-parked on the cross street. The particular gold of the liquid amber trees that lined the Midtown blocks, the color of them against the flat gray sky above the half-dissolved layer. I thought about my grandmother in 2003, writing a check from my grandfather's estate proceeds to purchase 15% of a company her son-in-law was building, and telling no one and sitting down to wait. There are people who wait with impatience, who experience waiting as a kind of deprivation, a gap between what is and what should be. My grandmother was not that kind of person. She waited the way you tend something you've planted in good soil, with attention but without urgency, understanding that the growth that happens in the dark underground before anything is visible is not waiting at all. It is work. The retraction arrived on the 8th day. It was a letter on Calloway Agricultural Supply letterhead, the letterhead with the wheat stalk watermark that I had always thought was a reasonable design choice. It was addressed to Darnell at Yolo County Cooperative, with a copy to Gerald Foss and a copy to me. It stated that the previous communication regarding Presley Calloway had contained characterizations that were inaccurate, that Ms. Calloway had departed the company in good standing, and that Calloway Agricultural Supply regretted any confusion the prior communication may have caused. It did not use the phrase conduct issue. It did not apologize. It was written in the flat, evacuated language of legal compulsion, every word chosen to satisfy an obligation while committing to nothing, and it was, despite all of that, precisely what I had asked for in the Laguna Cafe 8 days earlier. I read it twice. I forwarded it to Darnell directly with a 2-sentence note. As I think you'll see, the prior communication from Calloway Ag Supply did not accurately reflect the circumstances of my departure. I appreciate your earlier confidence, and I hope we'll have the chance to work together again. Darnell replied in under an hour, already looking forward to it. Send me the Cascadia information when you're ready. I printed the retraction letter and set it in the manila folder with the other documents. The folder was getting thick. I had started it, without understanding what I was starting, the summer before my 5th year at the company. A manila folder in a bottom drawer, the kind of accumulation that happens when you are a person who counts things and doesn't yet know why. The compensation settlement took 11 weeks. I am not going to walk through each of those 11 weeks in detail, because the legal machinery of a compensation dispute is not the point of this story, and the details of it belong to a conversation that happened in Gerald Foss's conference room with 2 attorneys and a mediator and my father sitting across the table from me in the same chair he had occupied for every professional negotiation of the past 30 years. A leather chair, this one borrowed from the conference room rather than his own office, which gave him slightly less command of the room's geometry than he was accustomed to. What I will tell you is what that room felt like, because the room is where the 11 weeks resolved into something specific. My father came in the jacket with the Calloway Ag Supply logo. He sat across from me, and he did not look at me directly for the first 40 minutes, which I understood as the spatial grammar of a man who had not yet found a way to arrange his face for this particular situation. He had been in negotiations 100 times, across 30 years of building a business. Vendor negotiations, equipment financing negotiations, the lease renewals on 3 warehouse properties. He knew how to be in a room where something was being decided. But this room was different from any room he had sat in before, and he knew it, and the 40 minutes of not looking was the evidence of that knowledge. His attorney, the litigator from Roseville, was efficient and measured. She had the contained energy of someone who had read the file carefully and arrived with a clear recommendation for her client, and I could tell from the first 15 minutes of the session that the recommendation was exactly what Gerald had predicted. Settle the compensation claim, retract the defamatory statement, minimize exposure. She moved the conversation toward the settlement framework with the practiced directness of someone who was not interested in the emotional texture of what had happened, only in its legal resolution. This was her job, and she did it well. Gerald worked in the same register, precise, unhurried, substantive. The 2 of them spoke in the vocabulary of documented disparity and comparable roll metrics and equity harm claims, and the room moved slowly but in one direction, and after 2 hours and 40 minutes the settlement number was on the table, and both attorneys were recommending their clients accept it. The settlement covered 5 years of documented compensation disparity, the period for which full financial records were available, and for which the gap between my compensation and my brother's could be precisely quantified against comparable roll metrics. It was not the number I might have claimed if I had been inclined toward maximalism. Gerald had counseled against maximalism from the beginning, and he had been right. The point was not to extract the largest possible figure. The point was to establish, permanently and in writing, that what had happened was a quantifiable wrong, and that the quantification was accurate. The number that accomplished that was the number Gerald described as defensible, documented, and sufficient, which was the vocabulary of a man who had learned that sufficiency was a more durable outcome than excess. I signed the settlement agreement in the same conference room where I had signed the transfer document, the old paper smell the same, the window onto the back parking structure the same. Gerald witnessed it. My father's attorney witnessed it. My father signed his copy at a table in an adjacent room because the mediator had suggested, gently, that collocation for the final signatures was not necessary, and everyone in the suite had understood what she was actually suggesting and had agreed without discussion. Afterward, in the corridor outside Gerald's office, I encountered my father. It was not planned. He was coming out of the adjacent room as I was walking toward the elevator. The corridor was not wide, maybe 8 feet, the kind of institutional hallway that exists to connect rooms rather than to be occupied, and we were alone in it for the first time since the Laguna Café. He stopped. I stopped. He looked older than he had at the café. Not dramatically. 11 weeks is not enough time for dramatic change, but the quality of his certainty had changed in a way that aged the face around it. He was still Wade Calloway, still the man from the Elk Grove founding photo, still the man who had told me I wasted money on a Tuesday morning with the Sacramento Valley framed behind his head. But something in the set of his jaw had altered. Not humility, he was not a man who had arrived at humility. Something more like the expression of a man who has had to revise a calculation he believed was finished, and who is still living inside the revision, still working out what it changes. Presley, he said. Wade, I said. We stood in the corridor. The elevator was at the end of it, maybe 30 feet away. "Your grandmother," he said and stopped. "Yes," I said. He looked at the wall beside the elevator for a moment. A framed landscape print, generic, the kind of art that exists to give people something to look at when they need to look at something that is not the person in front of them. Then he looked back at me, and the expression that came across his face was something I had not seen there before. Not in 31 years of being his daughter, not in 9 years of being his employee. It was the expression of a man encountering a fact that his existing categories couldn't hold. Not devastation. Not guilt. Something more structural, the look of someone who has been given new information about the past and does not yet have a place to put it. "I didn't know she thought about it that way," he said. "I think she knew you didn't," I said. "I think that was the point." He put his hands in the pockets of the canvas jacket, the Calloway Ag Supply logo facing me, the wheat stock company he had built from a single bay operation in 1991, and now 15% of it belonging to the granddaughter of a woman who had watched and waited and counted. His shoulders settled slightly, an almost imperceptible drop, the physical adjustment of a man releasing a posture he had held for a long time. "You always thought you deserved more than you earned," he said. It arrived differently this time. Not as the pressurized verdict of the Laguna Cafe, not as the reflex defense of the phone call. It arrived quietly, almost without inflection, the way a sentence arrives when the person saying it is no longer entirely sure it is true, but has not yet found the language to replace it. He said it the way people say things they have said so many times that the saying has become a kind of reaching, a hand extended toward the shape of something that used to be solid and is finding, this time, that it isn't quite where it was. I looked at him. I let his words finish arriving. "I know you believe that," I said. "I hope someday you'll look at the numbers and decide for yourself whether you're right." His jaw moved. He didn't answer. I walked to the elevator. I pressed the button. Behind me, after a moment, I heard him walk back toward the suite entrance. The door opened. The door closed. The elevator arrived. I stepped in. Cascadia Agricultural Partners took on its first formal client, Marcus from Dixon, 6 weeks after I left Calloway Agricultural Supply, which was before the settlement, before the corridor, before the retraction letter. Marcus didn't wait for the legal situation to resolve. He had made his assessment at the kitchen table in the Dixon operation the night he called me, and his assessment was about 11 years of watching how people worked, not about how the legal situation would resolve. By the time the settlement was signed, I had 7 clients under contract. 3 of them were accounts I had originated at Calloway. 2 were new relationships I had built from the referral network that began when Darnell told someone at the Yolo County Cooperative about the conversation with my father, and that someone told someone else, and the supply chain of information moved the way supply chains move when the product is trust, not through formal channels, through the lateral connections that form between people who have worked in the same industry long enough to know whose word is worth following. 2 of the 7 were accounts that Calloway Agricultural Supply had never touched. A mid-sized organic operation out of Woodland, Sandra's outfit, the one I had been meeting with when Renata's 3 messages arrived, and a vineyard management group in Napa that had been referred to me by a vendor contact who had watched the regional industry quietly for years and understood what was happening before I fully did. I rented an office in Midtown in November. A single room on the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian on a block with liquid amber trees, a window that looked onto the same trees I could see from my apartment 2 streets over, the gold of them going to rust by then, November doing what November does to October's colors. I put a desk in it and a filing cabinet and a whiteboard. I did not put anything on the walls yet because I had learned in the preceding weeks that the impulse to decorate a new space before you know what the space is for is a form of claiming that can foreclose the thing you haven't found out yet. The walls could wait. A second employee joined Cascadia in January, a young woman named Brinley who had been working in vendor coordination for a Woodland-based co-op and who found me through a mutual contact at the collective. She had a background in data management and the specific combination of patience and directness that vendor coordination requires, which is a combination rarer than it sounds. I told her in her first week that I had built the rate structure on a kitchen table in a midtown apartment and that the documentation systems were functional but not elegant, and she said that was fine. She preferred to build systems from scratch rather than inherit ones she didn't understand. I recognized that instinct. My revenue projections for Cascadia's first full year were conservative by design. built at the kitchen table, in the same spreadsheet application I had been using since before I had professional access to anything better, with the same approach I had used for the Dixon herbicide revision and the collective tier structure and the West Sacramento reconciliation document. Find the real numbers, map the actual constraint. Don't project past what the evidence supports. The projections were conservative. The actual numbers by the end of that first year were not. I won't give you the specific figure. That's not the point of this story, and my grandmother's letter said something about this that I've thought about since. The number is evidence, not the story. The story is what produced the number. What I'll tell you is that by the following October, exactly 1 year after the diesel smell and the Dry Creek dust and the Laguna Cafe and the certified mail and the corridor outside Gerald Foss's office, Cascadia Agricultural Partners had 12 clients, a second employee, and a service contract with the Sacramento Growers Collective, which had left Calloway Agricultural Supply 4 months after I did. The collective's operations chair called me personally to offer the contract. Her name was Patricia, not the Roger from years before, who had retired to the coast. Patricia had taken the chair in the interim and had a sharper manner and stronger opinions about equipment utilization and no patience for the kind of institutional inertia she described, in our first conversation, as waiting for permission to solve your own problems. We understood each other within 10 minutes. We always felt like we were waiting over there, she said. We like working with people who treat us like we know what we're doing. I thought about the tiered scheduling system I had built in my 3rd year at Calloway. The model that let individual member farms book without going through the committee for standard orders, that Roger had approved after the facility visit, that had grown the collective's revenue 31% in its first year. That system had traveled with me, not in any document or file, but in the understanding of what the problem actually was and why the solution that addressed it worked. You can build something in a specific place for a specific company and have it remain yours in the way that knowledge is yours. Portable, persistent, belonging to the person who developed it rather than to the organization that employed them at the time. I'm glad you called, I said. My mother came to the Midtown office in December. She came on a Saturday when the office was quiet. Brinley was not in, the building had its weekend stillness, and the December light through the window was the particular thin, direct light that replaces October's valley gold as the season moves deeper into itself. She brought coffee from the place on J Street that she knew I liked, a flat white from a cafe that had been on that block since before I was in college, and that I associated, in the way you associate certain places with certain periods of your life, with the version of Sacramento that existed before I understood the company's internal architecture and what my position inside it meant. She sat in the chair across from my desk and looked around at the office. The whiteboard, the filing cabinet, the window with the rust-colored trees on the street below. I had put one thing on the wall since I'd moved in. A framed copy of the Cascadia Agricultural Partners business registration, the state document, the one with the filing date on it. Not decorative. Just present. The first document in what would become this office's version of the manila folder, the counted things arranged so I could see them. It looks like you, she said. I hope so, I said. We drank the coffee. She asked about the business with the genuine curiosity of someone who had spent decades watching a business be built and had absorbed, through that proximity, more understanding of the mechanics of it than she was usually credited for understanding. I told her about the collective contract. I told her about the Napa Vineyard Group, which had become the most complex account in the portfolio and the one I found most interesting, for the same reason that the collective had been interesting. It was an account that required you to understand a system before you could help it, rather than an account that needed standard coordination applied to a standard problem. She listened with the focused attention she brought to things that mattered to her, which was more things than people generally assumed, including, I had come to understand, the company and its operations, which she had watched carefully for 30 years from a position that gave her a clear view without giving her any formal standing inside it. Your father, she said, eventually, setting her coffee on the edge of the desk. I know, I said. He doesn't say he was wrong, she said. You know he doesn't do that. I know, I said. But she stopped. Looked at the window for a moment. The rust-colored trees outside, the December light on them. He's quieter than he was. Since the settlement. Since the corridor. She paused again, and in the pause there was the weight of 40 years of watching a particular man be himself, and arriving, through that long watching, at something that was neither acceptance nor bitterness but some quieter third thing that had its own texture. He asked me once whether I thought she knew what she was doing. Your grandmother. When she bought the steak. What did you tell him? My mother smiled. A small smile, tired and entirely real. The smile of a woman who had been watching a particular man not understand a particular thing for a very long time and had arrived at the far side of that watching, where the not understanding no longer had the power to surprise her. I told him she always knew what she was doing, she said. I told him that was rather the point. We sat with that for a moment. The rust-colored trees. The December light, which is different from October's. Thinner, more direct, without the valley gold of harvest season, without the quality of richness that October carries. Through the window, Midtown went about its Saturday with the unhurried pace of a city that does not have anywhere to be on a weekend afternoon in December. She asked me once, my mother said, and then stopped as though she hadn't intended to start. About what? I said. She looked at the framed business registration on the wall for a moment. About you. About the company. It must have been 6 or 7 years ago. She called me on a weekday afternoon, which she didn't often do, and she asked me a question that I've thought about since. She picked up her coffee. She asked me whether I thought you knew your own worth. Not in a dramatic way. Just as a question she was apparently sitting with. What did you tell her? I told her I thought you did, she said. I told her I thought you always had. And she said, she paused. She set the coffee back down. She said that was exactly the problem. She said that knowing your worth and being paid it were two different things, and the distance between those two things was where families did their damage. I looked at the framed registration on the wall. The filing date was in November, the month after I left. The distance between September, when I had first asked for the third compensation review that didn't happen, and that November filing date was approximately 14 months. 14 months of knowing and not yet having closed the distance. She was right, I said. Yes, my mother said. She usually was. We said goodbye at the office door, and she hugged me in the way she always hugged me. Fully present, briefly, the warmth of it complete in its shortness, the particular language of a woman who had learned to deliver what she meant in a small gesture because the larger ones had not always been available to her. I watched her go down the stairs and heard the street door open and close. Then I went back to my desk and sat down in the December quiet and thought about the distance between knowing your worth and being paid it, and about the 14 months, and about 20 years of a woman in Louisiana-born name sitting on 15% of a company, patient as a planted thing, waiting for the ground to be ready. We're not fixed, I had told her at the end of the coffee, and she had said no. But we're talking, I had said, and she had said yes. That's where the Calloway family is, at the end of this story. Not fixed. Talking. Which is a different thing from healed, and a different thing from finished, and maybe, for a family with 30 years of uncounted labor and one manila folder in a bottom drawer and a woman who bought 15% of a future and kept it to herself, maybe for that family talking is the right word for where things are. Colton called me in March. Not the voicemail reasonableness call, not the tort threat call, a different call mid-morning on a Sunday, which was not a time he called. He asked how the consultancy was going. I told him. He told me the Elk Grove warehouse crew was asking about the West Sacramento staging system. Apparently the color-coded lanes had been adopted at the Elk Grove facility as well, based on a recommendation Garrett had made in an all-hands, characterizing it as a facility-level process improvement he had piloted. I absorbed that information with the equanimity that 9 years and a settlement and a grandmother's letter had, between them, made available to me. How's Dad? I asked. Running the company, Colton said. More quietly than before. We talked for 20 minutes. When we said goodbye, it was not with the surface warmth over the unsaid that the Calloway family had always used. It was something more tentative than that. Two people finding their way to a register that neither of them had needed before, because they had not, before, been in a situation that required it. Some distances close. Some close slowly. Some require a different kind of patience than the one you were born with. The kind you develop by watching someone who had it in full, who bought a 15% stake in your future and waited 20 years for you to need it. There are a few things I know to be true about how this story ends. Not the legal parts. Those are done, documented, filed in Gerald Foss's lateral cabinet and in my own filing cabinet in the Midtown office. I mean the truths underneath the facts. First, what you build with your own hands belongs to you in a way that no compensation structure and no conduct issue email can fully reach. They can slow you down. They can cost you time and money and 11 weeks of mediation and a corridor conversation that landed like something between a verdict and a beginning. But the thing you built is still built, and the knowledge that built it is still yours, and it goes where you go. Second, the people who count you correctly will find you. Not always quickly. Not always in the form you expected. Sometimes they find you in a letter from a grandmother who bought a 15% stake in your future 20 years before you needed it, and left it in trust with a man on Folsom Boulevard, and waited with the patience of someone who understood that the right moment was a real thing that arrived on its own schedule and could not be hurried. Third, a sentence repeated 3 times is not a truth. It is a habit. And habits, unlike truths, can be examined. My grandmother understood all of this. She understood it clearly enough to act on it in 2003, without telling anyone, and to organize the action carefully enough that it remained intact and available 20 years later, when the moment for it arrived. She did not need to see the outcome. She knew what she had planted, and she trusted the soil. I watched you work for that company, and I watched them count everything except you, and I decided a long time ago that someone in this family was going to count you correctly. She did. This story is a work of fiction, inspired by real emotional truths many families carry. If any part of this reminded you of your own family, a table where certain people's work was counted and others wasn't, a room where you were told what you deserved by someone who hadn't done the math, tell me where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments. And subscribe for the next one.